All right. Okay. So, 1 second. All right. You can start with your presentation, Richard.
Yeah, it'll take.
Yeah.
Let me just.
Take,
I'm on a different device, so let me just pull it up. It'll take some.
take your time. Take your time.
So
Let's
this
resume.
is like a general overview, not like really like a very specific ending. And like this is only part one. I'm probably gonna do a part two in the future because like this only covers 5 decades out of the 10 I want to. So like yeah, so 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s about the US basically. And like all these decades have something very different and unique happening on in them. So yeah. 1920s, let's start. So I'm gonna break it up socially and then politically and economically. So there's two things. So there's two stuff there here. So like socially, a lot has happened in the 1920s. So women's rights advance. So like women got the right to vote in the year 1920, and like there's a lot of stuff of in general women. They were more able to the social norm that women was controlled by men. It was slowly going away in the 1920s. Like it's there's still a lot of it was still there that men still like a lot of control like had the woman like was the women was definitely under men and like men was the dominant gender though like go women definitely improved in the standing and then after alcohol was banned but became popular in America so many Americans broke the crime by like bootlegging alcohol which is like undercover like making alcohol undercover that's moonshining and then like bootlegging is like getting it from other countries like Canada to its north and like it's they typically have these parties where like the police don't even care to arrest them even though it's breaking the law and crime increased and gangsters were often glorified so like crime was increasing because of alcohol, like all these alcohol related crimes. Alcohol was banned, so like the crime act naturally increased and gangsters since like no one likes everyone likes alcohol, gangsters actually became popular. Like police were having trouble arresting those gangsters who would actually be murdering people and stuff. So like one of the most famous gangsters is Al Capone in Chicago, and like they were taking so long to figure out how to charge him. They did eventually charge him in the year 1929, but like still, it was a very long process, and he became one of the most famous gangsters in U.S. And then the racism and violence against other races increased. So like there's like a white supremacy group named the KKK that came the previous decade, though like it reached its peak in the 1920s, and it often like not just African Americans but also immigrants, any other American that is not white and Protestant. So like Protestant is a religion, and white any Americans that's not that is getting targeted and killed often and immigration was more restricted. Congress passed acts to restrict immigration from most of the world, well, basically. So from India was banned, China was mostly banned already. Everywhere, yeah, and how it was targeting even Europe, so South and Southern and Eastern Europe, like Italian their immigrants were banned. So like only immigrants from like the Western Europe, so UK, France, those countries are still allowed out with the not much hesitation to come. And after World War One, many Americans wanted to be neutral. So they wanted to be neutral on the world change. So like they didn't like the idea of war at all. So like they just wanted They just wanted to get away from European affairs, so like they just thought about themselves, not really for the world. And then politically, economically, it was very capitalistic and favored big businesses, and like this led to a big rise in business. They often cut taxes for businesses, and they believed in trickle down economics, which basically says if you give tax cuts to the rich, the tax savings will eventually come down to the poorest of the people. Through it's like trickle down. So it will trickle down to the poorest people. Newest new products came like cars, washing machines, vacuums, which led to more consumerism. So consumerism is basically buying all these new products, even though you may not like have the money to afford it very good. Like people often bought it on credit, so like with a credit card or something, like they often bought these things, and like these were becoming more affordable. Oh, and washing machines and vacuums in particular, women were in the home like doing these stuff, right? With these appliances, they spent less time doing that stuff, so that they went more outside, like which led to more freedom for the women. That's another reason why. And then Republicans, which is like the conservative party, you hear more conservative, less government spending and stuff. That's the politics that dominated the time. And then the stock market crash came in 1929 due to numerous reasons, including so many people had credit that wasn't like repaid. Like banks lost money because of that, and it eventually went on a national scale. And it was the Great Depression, which I'll talk about in 1930. Here's some pictures about the 1920s. So like in the top right, you see the wall, the stocks crash newspaper, and then in the left you see Al Capone, that gangster, and then in the first, and then in the bottom center you see the cars, all those cars. That just represents how much new cars were made and how much people were buying it. And then like the alcohol smuggling in the bottom right, those are all the big all those again bootleggers who are trying to get alcohol and sell it to people. 1930s, socially, many social movements paused. Like there's not a lot socially because the economy was more important, because the economy was in a great depression and right now, and it affected the US particularly hard. So like in inexpensive forms of entertainment like music concerts and movies in the US became more popular. So like jazz was one of the major things. Like they often perform for free even, and like people will just listen to them because there's not a lot of entertainment during this time. I was they didn't have a lot of money, so the US became increasingly against Hitler's Germany. Those like they didn't want a war. They didn't like the idea of war. They didn't want it. That's the last thing they wanted to do, is to go to war or against in Europe, which they already went to in World War One, and they didn't like it, and a lot of lives were lost for them. So that's the reason. And economically, the Great Depression came as obvious. It was the worst global economic situation the world's faced, and nearly 25% of people in the US were out of work, and Democrats, because of the Republicans' power, they got the blame. So Democrats took power, and the president, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, abbreviated FDR, created a new deal. So like basically a set of stuff that would help the economy. So some programs like Social Security, which like gave money to the elderly monthly, and like all these spending programs to help create new jobs and like give more money to people. But like those are that's what the US economy is still heavily based off today. So giving these people spending checks, they could spend money which would help the economy grow, and then it will basically return in a cycle. So businesses will get that money, they'll need more jobs to make more stuff, and like they'll hire more workers, which will get more money to the workers. So that's the system that's happening. 1930s jazz, Louis Armstrong in the left, that's one of the most famous musicians during the time. He was African American. So like jazz was made by African Americans during the time, but while they faced a lot of like heavy discrimination in the US, they were still able to, especially in the 1930s, a lot of the racism was a little bit softening because of the depression. So like the Americans didn't care about race. They just wanted some entertainment and he provided it. And FDR in the top right, that president who did it, he would be the longest serving president, serving most of the 30s and 1940s in America. And like the Great Depression, you see, this is one of the bottom right, one of the most classical photographs of the Great Depression in American history. So that is that. So like you see a woman struggling with two children, basically. And they were actually moving on a migrant train to another place in search for better opportunities. So like all those stuff all the terrible stuff was happening during that time. 1940 the war came and many Americans wanted to serve their country or either militarily or at home. So like what happened basically, because 1930s they were against war and all of a sudden they are. Well, 1940s, like the U.S. government was the one that heavily brought it. They put propaganda posters in favor of war. So like they put like American symbols and like everything, and like this sparked the patriotism in America. So like that's what happened basically. So many Americans wanted that, and early forms of segregation against African Americans slowly got abolished, meaning like it got removed. Oof. So like in the late 1940s in particular, the Democrat president and Harry S. Truman, which succeeded FDR, he implemented numerous policies. That was like again that like basically stopped discrimination about of African Americans. Like for example, he made the military integrated, meaning like before the military was actually separated between black and white people. Like and white people often had better treatment, but the the military is the main focus is now filled with the both people, not just white and black people. They weren't separated; they were grouped together, no matter what. And like education rates started to increase, so like colleges became more as many men from the war came, and like they basically there was a bill by Congress which gave them the college, which let them go to college for very cheap rates. So many of them took it and they went to college. And like this is when the college started to ramp up in the US. Because before this time, very few people went to college because a lot of the stuff were trades and like a lot of immigration was happening. Immigration slowed considerably after the 1920s. So yeah, um, this is what happened. And like new systems, like new exams had to be determined in order to like create it to see who will go to which college, like the SAT and ACT, which is still in use today to see which as a determining factor. So all those factors were originating here. And like the Great Depression ended as Americans got to work because the government they're spending a lot on the war. Americans were having more jobs and stuff. They were able to very easily get out of the depression, and women workers increased as men went to fight. So like there's lots of millions of women went to factories and stuff to produce war materials, and Democrats continued to hold the presidency because the war was sparking popular sentiments among them. So yeah, and like in the left, there's a woman worker showing a propaganda poster to women, basically trying to help say them to support the war by working in factories. And in the right, there's basically an American the crew that was setting up an American flag on its fight against Japan, one of the major enemies in World War II. So that's the thing. 1950s. So this many families came following the war, and it's the biggest and it also shows the biggest population growth ever. So like a lot of those World War One, Two men, they were all there was relatively few losses in war for them. So like they all come back and they went to college and they started having families and stuff. So like all these men were having families and like more baby and the most babies ever. They're called baby boomers often. So like this is when like a lot of them were born. So like the biggest population growth ever. And like advancements for women largely halted as they went back home. So like they were being in the factory, but once men came back from the war, they were forced out as men came back to work. And like advancements for women were largely halted as they went back home because like a lot of because like housing was there was more expensive housing despite the more alliances and stuff. Like there wasn't many women were just simply bored. Like they didn't do work or anything. They just let the men work. They often just took care of the children and like that's all their life was. So it went back to the typical norm. And African American civil rights continued. A court ruling in 1954 for forced desegregated schools. So like schools cannot be separated between white students and black students. However, it took years for this to be actually enforced and stuff. As there's been many tensions there. And like leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., MLK, abbreviated, he led movements to like help African Americans protest the conditions. For example, he wanted to boycott a bus in a city called Montgomery, Alabama. So like the African Americans went up did not use the bus for over a year, and like the bus companies lost profits, so they separate because like the bus they separated between white and black people. So like that's the reason why they protested it, and then like the bus company had no choice but to give in and like are not and desegregate the buses. And and like whites and blacks can now sit together and stuff. Americans were panicked by the Soviets. It's during this time as the arms and space race began. So like they were building these nuclear weapons, which was banned in the previous century. Though like since the Soviets started developing it, so like both of them were stockpiling it a lot, and Cold War tensions really grew. And like Republicans came back to power in the decade it like economically gone back to more capitalism, but with more social spending from the New Deal. So like this is what the typical American economy looks like. Like so like some of the aspects of the New Deal, but like it goes back to be capitalism. So like and it was the best decade for most Americans because of the amount of jobs and like wages that were increasing. And for many of them, like there was a good there's a good balance between social how much spending in capitalism, free market, and such. So like that's one of the reasons why, and like lots of American affordable homes in the suburbs came, which like basically they were mass producing homes. So like all these homes were built in like one day, 2 days. They were all building these homes within days, and like people can buy them and like move into them, and like a lot of people that they move from the inner city into these new suburban areas which are outside the city. So many people men go to work through to the city by automobiles, and then afterward they come back. So like a lot of stuff like parking lots and stuff, all those all those stuff that typically are synonymous in today, they all came back. All those infrastructures today, they all have their roots in the 1950s. And more consumer products were sold, like refrigerators it helped preserve stuff. It was a lot of stuff. And like advances were made, basically. And like some of the stuff, the NASA, one of the social spending that came was NASA, which was to counter the Soviet Union in the space race, as the Soviet Union was launching missiles to space. So like they basically created, this is their first rocket launch in 1958, I believe, or 1959, either one. And then like the suburban towns in the top right, that's basically all of those were produced in the 1950s. So like these were all completely new towns. And like the bottom right was the communist fear that was occurring in America. So like that's a senator named Joseph McCarthy. He kind of took it to the extreme by exploiting that fear into convicting innocent people into for being a Soviet spies, and while they were Soviet spies, like he went a little too far because like there's no evidence for any of these claims, and like he became eventually rebuked, but still like the communist fear was there in America. 1960s. This was probably the most intense decade, and the last decade we are going to talk about. So socially, civil rights movement hit for African Americans hit its peak, and it started to show massive results. So we had these slow results, also, and but like all these massive results, like the Civil Rights Act in 1964, are basically banned any type of segregation in any public facility. So before it was like small victories, like in schools, in military, in buses, like all those. But like now everything must be, from water fountains to streets to walking paths to houses, all those stuff must be stopped. And immigration was loosened by the Immigration Quota Act of 1965. It allowed for more Asian Americans. So like now Chinese Indians can now come, and like Europeans and lots of stuff. They all were now easily able to come. And like Vietnam War came, and initially it was okay because like they didn't really suffer a lot of losses, and there wasn't too much violence as they thought. However, because there was a lot of violence, but the U.S. government was hiding it in order to get more people to join the war. However, however the media reporting started to show, and Americans were seeing all these images, and they were opposed to it like anything. And young Americans in particular were opposed to it because many of them were chosen to go and fight in Vietnam. So like many of them protested it, and like they began to counter social norms in general in America. So like they want more. So like they countered, for example, like they tried new stuff like new drugs, and also new and like lots of like a lot of they also tried to they looked at other religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, which was like brought yoga and like all those stuff. And like even though there's some good aspects of it, a lot of it wasn't good. And as like many of them became sick and like often got died at an early age due to these things. Things like particularly the drugs, which is one of the reasons why there was a little population slump there because of the amount of violence, and they began having supporting more violence against others. So like that was one thing, and they were often having messed up lives a bit because they're not having proper jobs and stuff. Though like these counter movements were successful in like getting the U.S. out of Vietnam and like pushing the Americans to go back to normal after this craziness. And like politically and economically, Democrats were in power most of the decade, though like political tensions were increasing, particularly due to the Vietnam War, or like stuff like all these. And then like JFK, which was a popular president, got assassinated in 1963. So like a lot of major assassinations happened. Like MLK in 1968, that was another major one. The civil rights leader, he got assassinated. The economy was continuing to grow. No more spending came to slow it down. So like all these spending on the Vietnam War, and then the Democrats tried to create a legislation for like the Great Society, as they call, which is more of an expansion of the New Deal, and like like it's too much spending in general. Like with the Vietnam War, they couldn't like handle it, and like it will eventually lead to a period of inflation starting in the late 1960s, and the Vietnam and Great Society spending plan was too expensive. So there's a lot of stuff that happened in 1960s. So like basically it was violent and stuff.
Okay.
And this is the Vietnam War.
Ajit,
Yeah.
Ajit,
Yeah, sir.
this session is getting over. So shall I start a new window?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I finished though.
Okay. For the questions, we'll start a new window.
Okay, sir.